So this recipe is kind of a cross between an apple wine and an extra hard apple cider. So I'll run through the list of ingredients. You have 7 liters of apple juice, so it has to be pure apple juice without any preservatives, so no sulfates. 1 cup of dried elderberries. An alternative could be raisins or sultanas. 2 cups of water. 1,000 grams or 1 kilogram of sugar, so either table sugar or in this case I'm using corn sugar or dextrose. 5 grams of ale or wine yeast. Half a teaspoon of yeast nutrient, and then a vessel to do your fermentation in. So a 2-gallon, in this case, jar with a faucet on the bottom. So the first step is to boil 2 cups of water, and we're going to add our cup of dried elderberries. So this serves basically 2 purposes. One, to rehydrate the berries, and to neutralize any preservatives if there is any added. In this case there isn't. And we're going to add 1 liter of the apple juice with the 1,000 grams of dextrose, which is corn sugar, which is readily available at most brewer supply stores. You could use table sugar as well. And it's important when you're shopping for your apple juice to make sure you read the label and make sure there's no preservatives like sulfates. Citric acid is fine, but you don't want anything to interfere with the fermentation process. So here I'm adding the 1,000 grams or a kilogram of corn sugar, dextrose, and I use a slotted spoon to stir that in. It takes roughly 10 minutes to come to a boil and run clear, and then I'm going to turn off my heat and let it cool down next to the pot of the dried elderberries. So that takes probably half an hour for both to cool down, because we're going to be adding that to our jar a little bit later. So get those steps out of the way first. So the fermentation vessel I'm going to be using, I actually have 2 of these, which you'll see in the video. These are readily available in most stores for serving like iced tea or lemonade, roughly 2-gallon in quantity, and it has a faucet on the bottom. I did replace the faucet with a metal one, it came with a plastic one. So the good thing about this is that when you're transferring from one jar to another, any berries or sediment generally will be below the tap. So it will sink below the tap, and then not too much goes into the other vessel. But I'll show you that a little bit later in the video. So yeah, you want to give it a good wash. Either use bleach and water or just plain water. If you do any soaps, make sure you thoroughly rinse that afterwards. And then I always follow it with a sanitizer. So in this case, it's Star San. That's just an extra step that any home brewer generally takes after they wash their vessels. The main thing is to make sure that everything is completely clean during the first stage of fermentation, because if there is any infection, it could ruin your entire batch. So just going to let that sit for about I think 5 or 10 minutes, and then it's ready to go. Here's our 5 grams of ale yeast is what I had on hand. You could also use a wine yeast, so like EC1118. This happens to be a general ale yeast that I have from a home brew supplier. Okay, so we're going to add 2 liters of apple juice. The reason we're doing that is because we're going to be pouring the warm mixture from our sweet mixture from the stove. And actually, sorry, 3 liters I'm adding. I just wanted to make sure that I'm adding the warm on top of the cool so they mix together, okay? So we're adding our sugary apple juice mixture on top of the 3 liters. And then we're going to add our 2 cups plus the cup of elderberries on top of that. So obviously it changes the color, but it also provides nutrients for the yeast. And we'll continue adding the liters of apple juice until we have roughly about 1 inch to 1.5 inches of headspace at the top of the jar. You do want some room for foaming. This is more like a wine than a beer. You're not going to have too much foaming, but you do have to leave some room for expansion, or else you could have a mess. So here I have a half a teaspoon of yeast nutrient. You don't have to have this because you do have the berries already, but I find this really gets things going and has a healthier fermentation. They also say the yeast nutrient helps to reduce the hydrogen sulfide, which can be produced during fermentation, which sometimes results in a kind of a rotten egg smell, but yeah, it does help to reduce that. So yeah, chemistry, fun. And you want to stir that for about a minute. Now adding the 1,000 grams of sugar gives you kind of an end result of a semi-sweet cider, not too dry, not too sweet, which is kind of where I like to end up. Sometimes if you let it ferment for a long time and you haven't added a lot of sugar, it can be quite dry and not have very much sweetness at all. So I think this recipe does end up with a nice semi-sweet taste. We're going to pitch our yeast. The temperature is roughly in the 70-degree mark. You don't want to be too warm or too cold. And you're going to be fermenting just at room temperature. So in our basement, it's probably about 68 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. But we've added our 5 grams of yeast. You don't need to stir that in. And I have a completely clean shop rag that I just place over the top with the lid that I just put on loosely, so the air can still exchange from inside the jar to the outside without it letting any nasties in. So if you want to use a airlock lid with a hole in the airlock, you can do that as well. But for just a simple cider like this, this works every time. I haven't never had an issue with it. Any other brewing I do use an airlock, but this tends to work well for this. So there you can see everything is going to eventually settle, but within the next day, everything will reactivate and start to ferment. So before that happens, I just want to do a specific gravity or density to see where we're at. And the target was around 1080. So we have a pretty sweet mixture to start with, just like if you were to brew a wine, it'd be in the same range. So here I am using a wine thief, but whatever method you need to do your density. And I don't do a density for every brew that I do. It's just for the video to show you where we're starting at. And the way I read it was 1.088 is where we're going to start at. So this is day 2. You can see all the berries have floated to the top. There's lots of foaming. And if you look closely, you'll see little tiny bubbles, so there's active fermentation going on. But what I do on the second day, I take a sanitized spoon and make sure everything is clean. And you just want to stir that for, roughly 10 seconds. What you're doing is just making sure the berries are well incorporated into the rest of the mixture. You only have to do this once. I only have to do this usually day 2. And then it's good to go for 14 days roughly that I leave it to do the primary fermentation. Okay, so just give it a quick stir. And then we're going to add our cloth back on and just loosely place the lid back on. And you want to place this in the house kind of a draft-free, steady temperature of anywhere from 65 to 75 degrees. Not too hot, not too cool. So this is day 3. There's really good bubbling and fermentation going on. You can see the nice color given off by the elderberries. So this will change in color a few times during the total time is 28 days, so basically 4 weeks. You can do it in a shorter period of time, but I get best results when I let it go a little bit longer. So this is after 2 weeks. So similar to brewing wine, primary fermentation is generally done in 2 to 3 weeks. But so this is after 14 days. You can see there's not as much fermentation going on, but there is more to come. But we are going to transfer into another similar vessel. And I'll show you, I add just a piece of tubing to the faucet, and I use a zip tie to secure it. Whatever method you want to use to transfer it, you could use a wine thief or even pour it into the next vessel, but I find this way It's the least amount of disturbance, least amount of oxygen transferring from one vessel to the other. And just like you would in winemaking, you're basically leaving behind the lees, so any residual dead yeast, other particles, most, I would say, all of the berries that you are not using for the secondary fermentation. And there you saw me loosening off the lid so you can have air being introduced into the jar. So just start your flow. Try to eliminate as much air in the liquid as possible into the secondary vessel. But I do like these because the tap is a little bit, it's an inch off the bottom of the jar, and it leaves behind a lot of the, basically the junk that you don't want in secondary. And there you can see what's left over. Most of the berries, I would say 95%, stayed behind, but there's going to be a few left in secondary. So you just take a ladle or anything you need to use to scoop out what's remaining. Again, most of them were left behind, but there's going to still be a few stragglers. And after I do that, and before I put the lid back on with the cloth, I'm going to do a specific gravity to show you where we're at halfway through the process, basically. So at this stage, more than half of the fermentation is done. So we're around 1030, which would give you roughly about 7.4, 7.5% based on our starting gravity. But we're going to go another 2 weeks. So we're going to put our clean cloth back on with the lid not completely tight. You still want the air exchange. And I'm going to place the jar in a cold cellar. You don't have to do this, but the cooler temperatures help drop out anything that's in suspension, so you end up with a clearer cider if you put it in a colder area. So there, after 28 days, we end up with 1014, which gives about a 9.7 ABV approximation. So here you can see I've already transferred 1 bottle's worth out of the jar. And here's the bottles I'm using. These are PET plastic bottles. They're 500 milliliters each. So I'll just show you filling 1 bottle. You just want to go nice and slow. You don't want to add too many extra air bubbles or oxygen into the bottle itself. So once you fill your bottles and you cap them, you want to let it sit for 4 to 5 days. We're not going to add any extra sugar for priming or for adding extra carbonation. There's enough remaining in the liquid to carbonate this naturally. Okay, so we're going to cap it tightly. I always give it a little bit of a shake just to make sure the mixture is nice and consistent. And then they're going to sit about 4 or 5 days, and that'll give you just enough fizz to give you a light carbonation. Okay, so just put it at room temperature somewhere. And that's our yield. So I think I ended up with about 6.5 liters worth from a 7 liter, roughly 7 liter batch. So pretty good yield. There you can see the little tiny bubbles. So lightly carbonated. And it has a nice flavor with the elderberry, a slight tartness and a slight berry flavor. But if you use raisins, you can have a nice flavor as well. I've tried that. Or you could just use the plain method and not add any berries. But I encourage you to try this out. It's easy to make, just takes a bit of time and patience. Thanks for watching, everyone. Stay tuned for more videos. Please subscribe, and bye for now.